All right, today we are diving into a fascinating intellectual clash that happened well over a century ago. The subject, one of the most debated figures in all of human history. We're looking at two competing theories, two completely different answers to the exact same question. Let's get into it.
So, here's the big question, right? It's one that has driven countless scholars and historians for centuries. If you try to set aside theology, if you strip away all the layers of doctrine and tradition, what are you left with? Who was the actual person at the center of it all? That's the puzzle we're exploring today.
Now, right around the turn of the 20th century, you get these two books, and they propose these bold and frankly completely incompatible theories. On one side, you have a deep, critical dive into historical texts, and on the other, a journey into the world of ancient mythology. Both were aiming to find the origin story, but their paths could not have been more different.
So here's our game plan. We're going to start by framing this whole quest for the historical Jesus. Then we'll zoom in on each of our theories, the historical detective versus the myth decoder. We'll put them head-to-head to see where they clash. And finally, we'll talk about why this old debate still feels so relevant today.
Okay, first up, let's set the stage. Let's look at how this search for a historical person became such a huge intellectual movement, a real puzzle that some of the sharpest minds of the era were absolutely determined to solve.
You gotta picture the scene. This was a time when the tools of modern history were still pretty new and exciting. And, for the very first time, scholars started to apply them to a figure who, until then, was mostly seen only through the lens of faith. The goal was audacious, to say the least. Could they peel back the layers and find the man behind the icon, the person who actually walked the roads of first-century Judea?
All right, let's meet our first contender. He was a theologian, a world-class musician, a philosopher, and he approached this puzzle like a master historical detective. His name was Albert Schweitzer. So, in 1906, Schweitzer just drops this bombshell on the academic world with this book. And his approach, wow, it was devastatingly effective. See, before he even presented his own ideas, he systematically took apart every major theory that came before his, exposing their hidden flaws and biases one by one. And here was his big, killer point. He said that for over 100 years, historians hadn't really been finding a first-century Jewish prophet at all. Nope. He argued they were just unconsciously creating a Jesus who looked, well, a lot like them. A kind, gentle, rational teacher of ethics who would have fit in perfectly in 19th century Europe. Now, to really get what Schweitzer was driving at, we have to understand this one key term, eschatology. It sounds complicated, but it's really about a worldview that's focused on the end times, a belief that the world as you know it is about to come to a sudden, dramatic end.
So after tearing down all these comfortable, modern-looking Jesuses, Schweitzer unveils his own conclusion. The historical Jesus, he said, was a man entirely of his own time. He was strange, he was intense, a radical apocalyptic prophet who was absolutely convinced that God was about to smash into history and bring about the end of the age like any day now.
And this just brilliantly sums up his challenge. He basically threw down the gauntlet to everyone. He said, look, you have two choices. Either you grapple with the historical evidence for this strange apocalyptic figure, or you're not actually doing history, you're just making stuff up.
Okay, now let's do a complete 180. We're going to pivot to a totally different and honestly an even more radical explanation. This one isn't looking for a man in history, it's looking for a pattern in myth.
So this book comes out, and it's published anonymously, which, makes sense because the theory inside was just wild for the time. It argued that to find the real origin of Jesus, we shouldn't be digging through historical records of Judea, we should be looking at the ancient myths of the sun.
So the core idea here, it's pretty simple actually. It says that if you look at ancient Aryan, or what we'd probably call Indo-European cultures, you keep finding the same basic story again and again. A divine savior is born of a virgin, he suffers, he dies, and then he's resurrected. The book's argument? This isn't a historical event. It's an allegory for the sun's journey through the sky, its birth at the winter solstice, its death around the spring equinox, and its glorious rebirth and triumph in the summer.
And this is how the book tries to build its case, right? By laying out these alleged parallels. It points to what it sees as striking similarities in the stories of divine figures from totally different cultures, like Krishna in India or Osiris in Egypt, and argues that the key beats of Jesus' story, the virgin birth, the death, the resurrection, they aren't unique historical events. They're just echoes of a much, much older solar myth.
Okay, so let's pause and put these two right next to each other. On one hand, you've got the historical detective, and on the other, the myth decoder.
Their methods, their sources, their conclusions, they could not be more different. It's a fundamental divide.
And when you do that, you really get to the heart of the conflict. Schweitzer uses sharp historical analysis on the Gospels to find a very specific person from a specific time and place. The sun myth theory, though, it uses comparative mythology on stories from all over the world to argue there was no specific person at all, just a timeless myth. So one approach treats the story as a piece of corrupted history that we need to recover, while the other sees it as a timeless allegory that we need to decode.
So let's pull back for our final section here and ask the big question. Why does any of this still matter? Why does this century-old intellectual battle continue to fascinate and provoke us today?
Well, this whole clash, it really pushes us toward a much bigger, more fundamental question about how we understand the past period. Think about the two methods we've looked at. One is a deep dive into specific historical texts, and the other is a broad search for universal patterns. Is it possible that the tools we use to study history don't just find the truth, but actually help create it? And that's the thought I want to leave you with. When we go on these quests for history, searching for the real story, are we truly uncovering something that happened back then, or are we in the end just holding up a mirror to ourselves, our own biases, our own hopes, and our own time?